Hello and welcome to Real Obscure. My name is Kevin H. Shaw, and in this episode we're travelling back into the days of legend, where John Wayne's son, a Bond girl, and a Doctor Who will battle against sinister sorcery, fantastic creatures, and horribly uncomfortable filming conditions. From 1977, it's the fantasy epic Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. So before we look at this movie, let's have a quick crash course in Sinbad lore. The character of Sinbad the Sailor is commonly associated with the 1001 Nights, a collection of Middle Eastern folk tales and stories, sometimes known as the Arabian Nights from its first English translation, the Arabian Nights Entertainments. However, the tale of the 7 voyages of Sinbad, along with the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves and Aladdin, were later additions, added to the French translation in the early 18th century. Now, in these stories, the character of Sinbad is somewhat different to the heroic explorer we commonly think of when we consider the character. Instead, here he's a rich merchant driven much more by the desire to accumulate wealth than engage in acts of heroism. For example, in one voyage, he finds himself trapped in a cave and bludgeons his fellow survivors to death to steal their supplies and riches. Yeah, that's not something that generally appears in the cinematic canon that we're used to. Although there were a number of animated adaptations featuring him, the character we think of as Sinbad first appeared in a live-action tale in 1947's Sinbad the Sailor, in which Douglas Fairbanks Jr. played the titular character recounting his 8th voyage, in which he sought the lost treasure of Alexander the Great. In 1958, Columbia released the first of what would be its trilogy of Sinbad movies, although the term is used very loosely as there's no on-screen continuity between any of the movies. Behind the camera, however, it's a different matter. All 3 of the Columbia Sinbad movies were produced by Charles H. Schneer. Schneer was a writer and producer, probably best known for his collaborations with the great Ray Harryhausen. Harryhausen was without a doubt one of the most influential animators and special effects creators of the 20th century. I could dedicate an entire episode just to his career. His stop-frame animation technique, dubbed Dynamation, was revolutionary, and his work served as a massive influence on practical and animated effects for decades. During World War II, Harryhausen worked in the US military's Special Services Division as a camera assistant under Frank Capra, who, of course, would go on to direct It's a Wonderful Life, honing his movie-making skills and using discarded film stock to work on his animation techniques. His work so impressed Willis O'Brien that the veteran animator hired him in 1947 to work with him on The Mighty Joe Young, which was later released in 1949. From there, Harryhausen worked extensively with producer Schneer, with a roster of a dozen movies emerging from their collaboration. The two worked together for almost 30 years, with their final movie together, and indeed Harryhausen's last movie, Clash of the Titans, being released in 1981. However, before that, the pair collaborated on what would also be another last, in the form of the final movie in their Sinbad series, Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. In what had become their standard production process, the movie was co-produced by Schneer and Harryhausen, with Schneer acting as a kind of technical advisor to actor-turned-director Sam Wanamaker, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines, The Outer Limits and Heart to Heart, and also the father of actor Zoe Wanamaker. Wanamaker's role was to handle all of the actors and their performances, with Schneer overseeing the footage and making sure it was blocked out in a way that would allow Harryhausen to work his magic. Although filming was completed in 1975, it took Harryhausen almost 2 years to produce the effect sequences, working alone in his studio without assistance or outside interference. The movie stars Patrick Wayne in the title role. The son of John Wayne, Patrick Wayne appeared in a number of movies with his father, including The Quiet Man, The Alamo and Big Jake. However, he's probably best known for his portrayal of Sinbad in this movie, and another fantasy adventure movie, The People That Time Forgot, both of which were actually released in 1977. He also auditioned for the role of Superman in 1979, and played Pat Garrett in the 1988 western Young Guns. Away from the big screen, Wayne worked extensively in television, appearing in episodes of Charlie's Angels, The Love Boat, and Fantasy Island. Jane Seymour stars as Sinbad's love interest, the Princess Farah. Her real breakout role was that of Solitaire in the James Bond adventure Live and Let Die, and she later went on to find a new wave of fans with her role in the long-running Western series Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. Her career spanned both cinema and television, with appearances in Somewhere in Time, Battlestar Galactica, and Smallville. Taryn Power plays Dione. The daughter of the actor Tyrone Power, she was cast by Schneer with the idea of having the son of John Wayne and the daughter of Tyrone Power appear in a movie together because he believed they would have some chemistry. An interview with Jane Seymour on the Blu-ray reveals that the casting of Power came as a shock to her, as the original role of Farah had been significantly larger, but when she arrived on set, she discovered that the role had been split between them. Now, this makes me wonder if originally Power and Wayne were supposed to have some kind of romantic connection, and it was later changed, as the two of them actually have very little in the way of interaction in the movie. Rounding off our main cast is Patrick Troughton. Troughton is best remembered as the second Doctor in Doctor Who. He also appeared in The Scars of Dracula, Moonraker, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, and extensively in television roles, including Dr. Finley's Casebook, Adam Adamant Lives, The Feathered Serpent, and Doomwatch. Perhaps his best known TV role outside of Doctor Who is that of Cole Hawlings in the BBC adaptation of The Box of Delights. So, what's it all about? Well, we start with the coronation of Prince Kasim, played by Damien Thomas, of Twins of Evil and Roman Polanski's Pirates fame. His sister, the Princess Farah, played by Jane Seymour, and his uncle Balsora, played by Bruno Barnaby, watch on in delight. However, his stepmother Zenobia, Margaret Whiting, and her son Raffi, Kurt Christian, who is actually making his second appearance in a Sinbad movie, having portrayed Haroun in The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, do little to hide their displeasure. However, before he can be crowned Caliph, the throne room is engulfed in a mysterious smoke, and flames appear around the throne as Farah screams in terror. Sometime later, Sinbad and his crew arrive in the port of Chirac, only to discover the walled city is under curfew due to an outbreak of the plague. Sinbad, desperate to see his friend Kasim, and, more importantly, his beloved Farah, is informed of this malaise by a mysterious merchant who offers them sanctuary in his tent outside the city. The men agree, and as they're watching a troupe of dancers and enjoying the merchant's hospitality, they're shocked to discover it's a trap. When poisoned drinks fail to kill them and an attack by the merchant, who is revealed to be Raffi, also fails, the tent door blows open as a mysterious hooded figure enters. Her eyes transform into those of a cat, and using dark magic, she raises a trio of ghouls from the earth, who promptly attack them. Now, there's a little bit of a thing among Harryhausen fans that this isn't his best movie, that some of the ideas are a little familiar, and it lacks the imagination of the earlier adventure movies. I personally don't agree with that, but I can see the reasoning behind it in some instances, such as this scene. It feels like a revisit to the incredible skeleton fight from his earlier masterpiece, Jason and the Argonauts, but just doesn't quite measure up to the sheer brilliance of that sequence. It's still very well done, combining live-action swordplay and props, including burning torches, and is probably something you won't appreciate until you take a moment to consider how technically difficult such scenes are to shoot. And had he not already done this with the aforementioned skeleton fight, then I'm sure this would be considered more impressive than it is. But there's just something lacking in the design and execution of this scene. The skeletons had that kind of character and life that Harryhausen was famous for, but here these ghouls just feel lifeless. They don't really have the personality of some of his creations, and also with their black, insect-like eyes, they bear a passing resemblance to the Selenites from his earlier movie, The First Men in the Moon. Like I say, it's all well executed and technically impressive, but it feels a bit like he's retreading some of his greatest hits, and doesn't quite have the magic or imagination of some of his other works. So Sinbad is able to defeat the ghouls and they flee to their ship, but not before he meets Princess Farah, who has escaped from the city and come searching for him. The two leap from the harbour and swim to Sinbad's ship where, after comforting her with some wine and explaining that he wishes to marry her, she explains that she cannot until her brother Kasim is restored to his true nature. Too upset to explain further, she promises to tell him more in the morning. Morning comes and Balsora visits Sinbad aboard his docked vessel. Farah has explained the mystery of Kasim's condition, although we still don't know what it is, and they discuss a possible solution in the form of an ancient alchemist named Melanthius. As they do so, the horses at dockside become restless and Zenobia arrives. Sinbad greets her and they speak of Kasim. Zenobia declares that he is beyond help, but an enraged Farah, who accuses Zenobia of being the witch behind Kasim's condition, blurts out that Melanthius can help. Yeah, be ready for a few very stupid moments like this. There are quite a few where characters just suddenly seem to become idiots because the script needs them to be. Zenobia states Melanthius is a myth, and even if he did exist, he cannot help Kasim, because if Kasim is not crowned Caliph within 7 moons, he will lose the right, meaning her son Rafi will ascend to the throne. Sometime later, Sinbad and crew prepare for their journey, bringing treasures for Melanthius and loading aboard a baboon who, it transpires, may not be all he seems. There's a great reveal where crewman Hassan, who is played by Nadim Swahala, the father of Julia Swahala of Ab Fab fame, sees the baboon playing chess with Farah, and when his shouts bring Sinbad into the cabin, there's this great exchange. "Captain, the beast was playing chess. I know, he has beaten me twice." Yes, it turns out that Prince Kasim has been transformed into a baboon, and so it's up to Sinbad and his crew, along with Farah, to head out to seek the aid of Melanthius. But Zenobia is not going to simply depend on the Greek alchemist being a myth, and she and Rafi pursue, aided by one of her most powerful creations, a bronze giant with the head of a bull, Minotaur. They find their way to Melanthius, played by Patrick Troughton, who, with his daughter Daoni, Taryn Power, and a group of locals dwell on the island of Kasgar. You'll recognise Kasgar as it's actually Al-Kazne in Petra. If that's still not ringing any bells, you'll know it as the resting place of the Holy Grail in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Or for those of you with a more goth leaning, it was featured in the Sisters of Mercy's Dominion video. The majority of the movie was filmed in Malta, but these scenes were shot using a second unit and stand-ins for the main cast, who were later shot against a blue screen, which is the forerunner to modern green screen, with footage of the location added later. It's weird to see because a lot of the body doubles don't really match. Their hairstyles are different and even some of their costumes change. And then there are scenes where the background isn't in sync with the actors who are just walking on the spot. But it was 1975, and that's what special effects looked like back then. Anyway, Melanthius speaks of a race of people called the Aramaspi, who dwelt in the ancient land of Hyperborea, who had the ability to combat dark magics using their advanced technologies, and how this could help Kasim's condition. Now, the Aramaspi were actually a real mythological people, if that's not a contradiction, and the Greeks did indeed believe they lived in the Hyperborean regions to the north. Although he's initially dismissive of their plan, Melanthius experiments with a candle and some lenses, which he says are similar to the Aramaspi's powers, and this persuades him to have a sudden turnabout, and he and Dione agree to accompany them because, well, the story needs them to. It's just a very oddly handled scene, with the connection between his light experiments and the transmutational powers of the Aramaspi remaining unexplained, and his switch from outright refusal to joyfully agreeing to accompany them is just really badly handled. And so they head off, encountering a number of creatures, both friendly and dangerous, while Zenobia and Rafi race to beat them to the Temple of the Four Elements and ensure Kasim does not become Caliph. Now, as ever, we'll learn about how that plays out in the spoiler zone, which we'll get to later. There are a few things though I would like to talk about before we get there. For starters, Harryhausen's work is superb on this movie. As I mentioned, perhaps it's a little self-derivative in places, but the magic is still there on the whole. Harryhausen had a knack for giving his creatures life and a sense of reality, despite them often being of a magical nature. He treated them like they were actors and would always give them some business to do, be it looking around, reacting to human actors realistically, or even just scratching themselves. And, the ghouls aside, he does a great job here, particularly with Kasim and the later troglodyte Sinbad and Company encounter. Minoton is also a great creation. Again, perhaps it could be said that this metal giant is a retread of Talos from Jason and the Argonauts, but he's such a cool looking character that I'm happy to overlook that. Although predominantly an animated character, they did use a life-size stand-in for some scenes, with the bronze Minotaur being played by an uncredited Peter Mayhew, who would, in a twist of irony, go on to play Chewbacca in Star Wars, a movie that came out at the same time as Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, and, with its superior effects and more dynamic action, was pretty much the death knell for Harryhausen's style of filmmaking. The cast do what they can with a script that handles some of the character comedy well, but falls a little flat with its exposition. There are some scenes that do feel like we need to get to here, so let's have a thing happen and then do it, such as Melanthius' odd turnaround on the subject of travelling with Sinbad. Similarly, there are moments where characters have to be stupid to make the plot work. We've already mentioned Farah's reveal of Melanthius to Zenobia, but there's also a scene where the supposed genius Melanthius shows his ancient scrolls to Zenobia, revealing the secret route to the Temple of the Four Elements. The movie also features some surprising nudity. Jane Seymour spends most of the movie in fairly skimpy outfits, which she also frequently removes. There's a scene where she and Dione are skinny dipping, and both their bottoms are briefly visible, although they're underwater, and there's a later scene where she's sitting on the shoals beside the river. Seymour's nudity is covered by her hair and a bit of draped clothing, but she was indeed persuaded to go completely naked by Schneer, In a scene he explained, "Came about in development of the picture," adding, "I wanted to keep up with those elements that had become possible." Now, I have no idea what he meant by that, but I've got to say 7-year-old me was quite happy to see that scene. Now, according to Seymour, it was a very tough shoot. In this age of CGI backdrops, mocap and digital compositing, it's easy to forget that for actors in the 70s, working in isolation on a green screen stage where a monster was simply a stick with some tape on it was a completely new experience, and a hard one at that. Add to this that many of the scenes were shot on a soundstage in Malta that had no kind of air conditioning, and it was frequently over 100 degrees on set. Most of her costumes had to be dry cleaned, and she claimed that most of them probably just rotted away by the end of filming due to the copious amounts of sweat they absorbed. Worst of all were the scenes where the party arrive in the snowbound wastes of Hyperborea. The cast were forced to wear actual furs, which were untreated and so stunk, and that further added to their discomfort. She actually filmed most of her scenes wearing only a bikini under the furs, but even so, she still passed out at one point due to heat exhaustion. Now, as I mentioned, the movie did sadly come out right as Star Wars hit cinemas. Now, for younger listeners who are confused here, the movie you know as A New Hope was originally released as simply Star Wars, and for those of us who saw it on its first release, that's what it will always be called. With its vastly superior effects, dynamic story, and much stronger performances from the cast, it made Sinbad in the Eye of the Tiger look cheaper and, well, just ropey. Wayne was no Harrison Ford. Both Farah and Dione do little more than make tea and scream, and were no match for the resourceful brilliance of Princess Leia. And despite a reliance on in-camera effects for their creatures over the meticulous work of Harryhausen, the whole look and style of Lucas's movie was revolutionary compared to Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger's plodding story and flat, uninspired direction. And it's a real shame. As much as Star Wars was a massive influence on me as a kid, I do still have a real soft spot for the Sinbad movies, particularly this one, as I did see it at the movie theatre on its release. Yes, I am that old. There's a charm to the animation style of Dynamation, and no disrespect to the effects work on Star Wars, but I just have such an appreciation of the talent and dedication of Harryhausen in the realisation of his creatures. I've mentioned how he breathed life into the characters, but there are also some fantastic technical aspects to the movie that, like all the best special effects, you don't even notice. There are fight sequences between live actors and animated characters where their weapons interact seamlessly. There's a scene, for example, where Sinbad knocks a flaming torch from the hand of a ghoul and it sets fire to the tent. It's a simple, short shot, but I can't even imagine how complex it was to coordinate. Similarly, he has humans and models walk in the same environments and walk behind and around objects in a manner that is just so natural and effortless. Okay, so the way the shots are composited and constructed does mean they have to be a little flatter and the framing is less dynamic. But the way in which everything, matte paintings, green screened actors, hand animated models, all work together really is incredible. And if you go watch the movie after this, please pay attention to the craft and technical precision with which it's all executed. Now, I think one of the things that you always have to do is take the approach of that there are two kinds of fantasy in movies. There's pre-Star Wars and post-Star Wars, because the release of Star Wars changed everything. Now, in much the same way as Doctor Who suddenly looked cheap and stagey, so the Ray Harryhausen movies, particularly from the 70s, do suddenly become kind of creaky looking. But if you can watch this with the eyes of a kid, as a throwback to simpler times, then there's a lot to enjoy here. It's a great movie for a rainy Sunday afternoon, the kind of thing you can watch and find engaging enough to enjoy, but that's also not going to ask too much of you. And sometimes that's all you need. Anyway, now it's time to step into the spoiler zone. So we've pretty much established the basic plot, and I think you know what's going to happen, but there are a few scenes I want to discuss before we get to the end. Of particular note is a scene where Zenobia, desperate to find where Sinbad is heading, uses a magical elixir to transform herself into a seagull. She surreptitiously boards Sinbad's ship and then transforms herself into a smaller version of herself to examine Melanthius's papers. But the Greek alchemist captures her. Attempting to test the elixir, he uses it to transform a deadly wasp into a giant deadly wasp. Yeah, remember what I said about some stupid people in this movie? In the chaos, Zenobia is able to steal back the elixir and transform herself into a seagull, escaping as Sinbad kills the wasp. She flies back to her ship, and Raffi is able to give the seagull what is left of the elixir, and she transforms back into human form. However, despite her best efforts, things do not go as planned, and as Zenobia cries in anger and frustration while Raffi looks on in horror, the camera pans down her body and we see that one of her feet has not fully transformed, leaving her with a bloated, webbed bird claw. It's actually a really disturbing bit of body horror and works surprisingly well considering it's basically nothing more than a prosthetic boot. But I do remember this haunted me for years when I saw it as a kid. Anyway, Sinbad and his party eventually arrive at the Temple of the Four Elements, having battled a giant walrus and befriending a primitive troglodyte. But Zenobia, Raffi and Minoton have beaten them to the temple. Forcing their way in and losing Minoton to falling masonry, Zenobia destabilizes the temple and the magical energy source within. Our heroes arrive, but before they can cure Kasim, Raffi attacks Melanthius in the hopes of killing the one man that can still help the prince. Baboon Kasim attacks Raffi and the two fall down a flight of stairs, with Raffi breaking his neck in the fall. Zenobia kneels before her dead son, while Kasim is loaded into a swinging chair and then positioned within the shining, but spluttering, beam of energy. He emerges restored to the delight of all, but before they have time to celebrate, the temple begins to collapse. Unbeknownst to our heroes, Zenobia transfers herself into the body of a thawing saber-toothed cat, the guardian of the temple, and as they attempt to leave, she attacks. The troglodyte and the tiger engage in a really nicely executed fight sequence, with the big cat emerging victorious. Sinbad takes up Minoton's boat hook and is able to skewer Zenobia as she pounces at him. With a final plunge of his sword into her prone body, he is able to defeat Zenobia. Our heroes are victorious, and we cut to the successful crowning of Kasim. But in a move preempting modern movies, there's a brief post-credits scene, well, shot, of Zenobia's eyes in their magical cat-like form. Were there ever plans for a sequel? Probably not, but it's a nice little sting at the end, just to say that perhaps things won't be plain sailing for Sinbad. Sadly, we will never know, because as I mentioned earlier, Harryhausen retired from filmmaking a few years later, leaving so many stories untold. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of Real Obscure. This episode of Real Obscure was written, directed, edited, and filmed in Dynamation by me, Kevin H. Shaw. If you enjoyed this episode, then please like, share, comment, and follow or subscribe. You can also leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice. If you have any thoughts on the movie or the podcast you'd like to share with us, you can email us at hellorealobscure@gmail.com. Our theme tune for Manfred and Siggy and our background theme, the Monster Dub, were both created using Udio. Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger is copyright 1977. All content is used here for educational and commentary purposes under Section 107 of the Copyright Act, Fair Use, and remains the property of the respective copyright holder. Presented here for the purposes of critique, commentary and discussion. No copyright infringement is intended, so please don't sue us. Or turn us into a baboon.